I've tried to address the future as well as the present. And so some of the things that say, why did you do that? Well, it's going to be because of those reasons. Because I understand the what's happening demographically in the world, what's happening economically in the world, what's happening politically and strategic politically in the world.
Yes.
And that these things are going to present a very different 21st, 22nd century than we have anticipated in the past, or that we even fantasized would happen. How do we make our revolution cascade to Canada, Australia, the UK, and the continent?
Yes, absolutely.
Right? So when I'm talking, that's the strategy I'm working under. It's not only the American continent and our problem, it's Western civilization in general. We tend to obsess over government, but the real answer is that this Constitution obsesses on law and rule of law, not on government. If you get the law right, it actually doesn't freaking matter much about your government. Is to put us back on our traditional trajectory that's dragged humankind, including ourselves, out of ignorance, poverty, starvation, hard labor, suffering, child mortality, and early death, and a nature and the being victims of nature that tries to exterminate us about every 50,000 years. To restore it to its original intent, right, which is to put this structure of restore the federation of small states, where we have the maximum competition between states and the maximum number of markets for people with differences, and so that we are always optimally calculating every possibility.
Instead of a huge federal bureaucracy just kind of controlling everything like an octopus.
Well, monopolies are bad. The failure of multiculturalism. I mean, it's fairly well known in the educational literature that integration has failed. Everywhere they've tried it, it's failed.
Yes.
It's pretty well documented now that it's failed everywhere we've tried it, no matter what. Whenever groups with different interests come up against each other, it's proximity that creates hostility, because we have different sexual, social, economic, and political market values. And when we come into contact with each other, we come into conflict with each other.
Yeah, so I think this is a problem the audience is going to be very, very well aware of. And so one of your goals is to fix that problem?
Correct. And he said, well, you don't have to worry, because there's millions of people out there who want this, and they're the only ones that matter.
Yes, that's right. The ones that want this actually, if you do the analysis, have the most ability to project power at the end of the day. Hey everybody, John Mark here. Welcome to part 3 of this 4-part introductory series where Kurt Doolittle and I are introducing to you the Proprietarian Constitution, or we could call it an updated Constitution for America, or a Constitution 2.0 for America 2.0. In this video, Kurt is going to be talking about the goals and objectives of this Constitution and how that differs somewhat from the original Constitution, partly because we're in a different situation today than the Founding Fathers were when they were writing the original Constitution, so we have to have some things that account for that. So you'll learn about that in this video, and then make sure that you're subscribed to my channel, because there's also going to be a part 4 that's also very interesting and very important. And then of course we're going to have future videos where we go in depth. The last thing I'll say before we jump right into it is I strongly encourage you to watch the first 2 or 3 videos, especially in my playlist called Proprietarianism Basics. Even if you're fairly familiar with proprietarianism and you've been around a while, those 2 videos are an absolute must watch, because they really explain the logic and why this is so powerful. I may come out with future videos as well where I explain why what Kurt is doing here with this updated Constitution and with proprietarianism enables us as grassroots right-wingers, as carriers of the flame of Western civilization's best practices, to build a system of power that is much stronger than we've had before, and that can last a very long time, so that our descendants don't have to go through this again, and so we don't have to keep fighting this age-old battle between left instinct people and right instinct people, and of course the parasitic elites as well, over and over and over again. So there is nothing more important going on the grassroots right wing today. There's nothing more important you can learn and understand than this updated Constitution, because we can talk about the problems all day long. We can talk about what the left is doing. We can talk about what the parasitic elites are doing. We can complain about it and whine and moan all day long. It does nothing unless we have a clear set of rules to rally around so that we can enforce them. And these rules must be rooted in understanding, science, knowledge, and wisdom. We have to have something to enforce that we can rally around. And this is it, folks. The updated Constitution, or what we might call the Proprietarian Constitution. So let's go right to Kurt here, talking about the goals of the Constitution and a couple of the ways it differs from the original Constitution. As you'll see, part of this is also restoring things to the way the original Constitution had it, because it's been messed up since then. So let's get right into it.
So I want to go into the major differences, because if we do that, we can sort of get people to top level.
The differences between the first American Constitution and this Constitution you're talking about, right? Yes, I think that's a good idea.
So first is, everybody thinks about the Constitution in historical context. Everybody thinks about most of the world in post-war context.
Post-World War II, yes.
Right. We have a lot of agitation in the public about the current context, and very few of us have an understanding of the near future and long-term future context. Now, last time you and I talked about the future context.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
And so the first thing is, what I've proposed includes addressing the future grand strategy. In other words, I've tried to address the future as well as the present.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right. And so some of the things that say, why did you do that? Well, it's going to be because of those reasons. Because I understand the what's happening demographically in the world, what's happening economically in the world, what's happening politically and strategic politically in the world.
Yes.
And that these things are going to present a very different 21st, 22nd century than we have anticipated in the past, or that we even fantasized would happen. And it's not a very good one, honestly.
So it's not just we're going to solve the problem that we have now and set ourselves up for the next few years. You have a long-term context in mind here.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to say, it's one thing to be the United States, but we have to think about a world in which we're not any longer the only world power, and that there are multiple bodies of people with competing interests, with billions, not millions of people.
Yes. And how do we set ourselves up as America, as Westerners, not just to benefit ourselves, but how do we help influence the rest of the world because we're in such a position of strength and power?
And moreover, how do we make our revolution cascade to Canada, Australia, the UK, and the continent?
Yes, absolutely.
Right? So when I'm talking, that's the strategy I'm working under. It's not only the American continent and our problem, it's Western civilization in general.
Awesome. I know there's a lot of people in the rest of the English-speaking world, we'll put it that way, that are going to love to hear that, Kurt.
Well, I got a lot of pressure from them, from the rest of it. I mean, frankly, from everywhere except France, I think, to say, well, what about us?
Yes.
Because we have more rights, we have preserved more rights of Anglo-Saxons until the present moment. It's easier for us to make a correction than it is for the rest of the people of the world.
Yes.
So it's kind of up to us, we happy few, so to speak, to quote the Shakespeare the Bard, it's up to us, we happy few, to save Western civilization from a second dark age.
Yes. So that makes sense. So that's the first improvement or change in the Constitution you're talking about there is...
some of the ideas, the policies, not necessarily the Constitution, but some of the policies are geared toward the expansion of this strategy of restoring Western civilization, not just to America, but for the rest of the world.
Makes sense.
All right. So I'm going to get that out. The second is our original Constitution was an experiment in governing under the common law. And this Constitution repairs those weaknesses that they didn't see. The common law, if people don't understand this I went back, I hit it already once, but it's the American, British, Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Indo-European common law. I mean, the Greeks started with the same thing and Rome started with the same thing, but they evolved under their own circumstances.
It's like our historical law, Kurt.
It's the historical traditional law of Western peoples.
Okay.
Right. And so the continental law, what they practiced was really Napoleon's imposition on Europe.
Okay. In Europe, you're talking about continental
Right.
Europe. Okay.
Okay. And so the difference is, under the common law, we're all the same. Every person's the same. And when somebody works in government, it's just one of us who's taken on that responsibility.
Uh-huh.
In the continental law, there's definitely political class and servant class.
Okay, that makes sense. And then how does what you have here in the Constitution differ from that?
I'm just saying that it continues the common law tradition.
It. Okay,
right?
Makes sense.
And that's mostly important because I want our European people, the people in Europe that follow us, to understand that that's a non-trivial difference in the fact that Anglo common law creates less regulation but more litigation, where the continental law creates more regulation and less litigation.
That makes sense. So continental law tries to shut more things down up front to reduce risk, which means you have less innovation but less lawsuits on the back end. And then the reverse is true in the common law. Right.
All right. So it repairs some of that. And we tend to obsess over government, but really it's kind of, when I started figuring this out, it annoyed me. We obsess over government. You people talk about how government should be this or that or whatever thing, but the real answer is that this Constitution obsesses on law and rule of law, not on government.
And that's really the key. That's for the audience. Do not miss that point. The key problem is law. The key problem to be solved, I guess you could say, not the form of government. And there are recommendations or different ways you can set up your government, from what I understand, Kurt, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But the law has to be right. It has to be natural law. So I didn't mean to cut you off, but I don't want the audience to miss that. That's a huge, important point.
It is important because if you get the law right, it actually doesn't freaking matter much about your government. That makes sense?
Yes.
So the government, the more government you have, the more deliberation you have over right and wrong and this kind of thing, rather than what do we spend it on and how much have we got, right? It's actually a failure of law. If you read the average European Constitution, it's a comic book. It's hysterical. They're not constitutions. They're articles of faith.
So you're saying it doesn't have a good foundation of law. It's just people writing stuff down that they want.
Ambitions.
Uh-huh. Interesting. And again, this is such an important point. The situation we have in America where we're just, for example, we have our two political parties and we're just at each other's throats and we're desperately afraid of losing the next election because they're going to shove stuff down our throats that we don't want and all this. This whole situation is absurd, and a lot of people kind of intuitively get that. But what Kurt is talking about here, when you get your rule of law right, it eliminates that whole thing. Yes.
You don't have to defend you. It depoliticizes the because the government is stuck now with trade. In other words, this class, I mean, most of the time, the upper class wants the lower class to behave.
Yes.
They'll give them anything if they'll just behave.
Just behave.
That's it.
Yeah.
The middle class wants them to behave enough that commerce can happen.
Yes.
But really, it's like the argument the conservatives have been making. I'll tell you what, trade us this for getting rid of the Department of Education, and then we'll give you your social whatever. But they don't want to make the trade.
Yes. So it's trades instead of fighting over trying to shove stuff down each other's throats. If you keep everything within the bounds of reciprocity with your rule of law, then the people or the representatives of the people are trading with each other, negotiating with each other, instead of throwing punches at each other all the time.
Right.
Powerful.
All right. So we obsess over it, but this obsesses over law. And when John and I get to this part, I don't know if we'll cover it all today, but it's really the government. Once you have that law, the rest of the government is really a Chinese menu. Really, I mean, I really positioned it like that, especially not so much at the federal level, because it has to be a certain the federal government has to remain a very simple thing. But at the state level, you just sort of pick your Chinese menu of how you want to govern, and it really doesn't matter, because as long as it's within the law, it doesn't, you can have a more left-wing government, a more right-wing government, whatever you want at the local level.
And when you, just to clarify for the audience, when you say more left-wing or more right-wing, you mean with a little bit more redistribution to people who are more needy, or you can have less redistribution. You can kind of choose. The thing is it's not shoved down people's throats through just, we get enough votes, or there's not all this stuff going on outside of reciprocity. That's right.
States, a lot of small states create a market for norms.
Yes.
And so we're already conducting the Big Sort. You can read The Big Sort. It's a good book. We're already sorting.
Left-wing people moving to places where more left-wing people live, and right-wing people doing the same to where more right people live.
Right. And it's, that's fine, except that the left people want to impose their way, which is suicidal, but that's what they prefer. And the right-wing people want to suppress the left's urge to consume.
Yes.
And right. And so the reason is because if you don't have kids and you're consumption oriented, your use of the commons is very different than if you have 5 or 6 kids. And so you need to be able to have high return commons with low individual consumption of them when you build families. And does that make sense?
Yes, that's a very powerful point that you had pointed out in your notes, and that you say very explicitly in this document as well, in the Constitution, is that the purpose of policy, or the focus of policy, is the intergenerational family, not just the individual can do whatever they want, no matter what costs it imposes on a family.
Right. So we have to, so we can have the choice of to want to oppress each other, or in the way I've structured this, we have various ways of separating so that we can go our own ways, but we still have the value of the continental government. And the reason for that is because the same reason the founders wanted is that once you allow an alien or a foreign power on the continent, we have an issue. So you have to maintain the federal government for military, trade, and ensure a last resort, meaning disasters, etc.
Just those functions, nothing else, if I remember reading in the Constitution.
Military, treasury, ensure a last resort, and then you have the Senate, basically, which functions as a market between the states. And that's really where you are. I mean,
yes. So just to be clear for the audience, a lot of the power in this, if I'm reading the Constitution correctly here, a lot of the power and the norms and all of that is just at the state level, as it really should be. More local, different strokes for different folks in many ways. And then there's this kind of limited federal government that operates the military and the treasury and a couple of necessary things where it's beneficial to have it there.
Yeah, it's almost purely depoliticized.
Yes. So we don't have these huge political fights.
Phenomenon.
Yeah. Yep.
Because that's where you want it. I mean, you want to have people with common interests, because that's what democracy is good for. It's good for selecting priorities among people with common interests. It's actually horrible for selecting choices among people with uncommon interests.
Yes.
Because the majority wins, and the other people get pissed. Which is what you see happening.
And that's what we're having right now. So just to pause here and let the audience just imagine how nice it would be to not have this huge political stress all the time, because the structure of the law is so good, and because just the structure of how things are organized as far as who has power where, a lot of the power devolved to the states, would make it just so much more peaceful, and we don't have so much of this political stress.
Yep.
That's great. So, Kurt, any other ones that you want to touch on there?
I want to cover 4 of them.
Okay.
Right? The first is that I'm trying to address the primary problem of the 20th century, and most of my work is focused on this one issue, which is the ability to criminalize disinformation, misinformation, and manipulation. In other words, just like John and I just talked about depoliticizing, I want to de-disinformationize the informational commons. So whereas the 20th century honestly was large, I mean, I talk about Hayek predicting this and everybody else predicting this in the pre-war period, but the 20th century there is as much or more pseudoscience, lies, sophism, and economic and financial. It's innumerously technically, but it's technically a sort of pseudoscience. There's as much of that as there is technical innovation. Because if you understand the 20th, we had a lot of technological innovation, but the science was actually all discovered in the 19th.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so we have had a huge increase in tech. We've actually not had a very huge increase in science. That's not true in every field. Obviously, in the biological science, particularly medicine, and in now genetics and cognitive science, we've had huge. But if you look at the progress of the social sciences, the economic sciences, political sciences, and the psychological sciences, it's been a joke.
It kind of like the human realm is kind of what I would call it with a general term. In the human realm, we haven't had science. We've had we've had some science, but a lot of it's suppressed. But we've had a ton of pseudoscience.
Furtherance. The purpose of that lie was to continue the great lies.
Yes.
The lies of Bose, Marx, Freud, that we're equal.
Yep.
And that now underneath this is one of the primary differences I didn't get to, which is that the enemy's strategy is to create discord so it can enforce a monopoly. Does that make sense?
Yes, because it wants to force its will on everybody else through the stress.
Authority.
Yes.
In other words, the reason they create this conflict is generate demand for authority, which they will provide. Whereas Western civilization, we are trying to do the opposite. We're trying to create harmony so that people can bubble up into a constantly rotating aristocracy.
Meritocracy, so the best people can do their thing and have a chance.
Right, because we've always been the small people on the edge of civilization, right? And so we need excellence to come up, and that's how one of the reasons we've been so successful is we create markets between the classes. And under Greece, under Rome, and even under the medieval period, you could get your way, you could escalate your condition if you were able to demonstrate it.
Yes. And this whole, our enemies want to do the opposite.
Exactly.
Yes.
They want to create discord so they can impose a monopoly, as if has worked so fantastically in the Middle East where all this stuff comes from.
Right. It's disastrous.
In the world's biggest shithole, with the world's least pleasant people, right, who caused the world the most suffering, who caused the world the most damage in human history, who've destroyed the 5 great civilizations of the ancient world and trying to destroy ours in India, and thankfully China's trying to resist them, and we wonder why that the way they work should work here.
So this is a lot of your intent here is to stop this then.
It's really to put us back on our traditional trajectory that's dragged humankind, including ourselves, out of ignorance, poverty, starvation, hard labor, suffering, child mortality, and early death, and the being victims of nature that tries to exterminate us about every 50,000 years.
Yes, absolutely.
So the second is to restore it to its original intent, right, which is to put this structure of restore the European Federation of small states, where we have the maximum competition between states and the maximum number of markets for people with differences, and so that we are always optimally calculating every possibility.
Instead of a huge federal bureaucracy just kind of controlling everything like an octopus.
Well, monopolies are bad.
Yes.
The only value of size is war.
Mm-hmm.
So the third is controversial, which is the failure of the integration, the failure of multiculturalism. I mean, it's fairly well known in the educational literature that integration has failed. Everywhere they've tried it, it's failed.
Yes.
It's pretty well documented now that it's failed everywhere we've tried it, no matter what. Whenever groups with different interests come up against each other, it's proximity that creates hostility, because we have different sexual, social, economic, and political market values. and when we come into contact with each other, we come into conflict with each other.
Yes. So multiculturalism has failed, etc.
And the democracy simply makes it an open license for people to enter into political conflict with each other.
Yeah, so I think this is a problem the audience is going to be very, very well aware of. And so one of your goals is to fix that problem?
Correct. And the fourth, it's a set of restitutions to compensate for that crime.
Okay. So some restitutions that restore
our
way of doing things, restoring how we've gone backwards.
Right. And they escalate in face of resistance.
Okay. So the more resistance we get, the more punishment is doled out to them.
Right.
Okay. That makes sense.
So basically there should be something to offend everyone.
Well, I tell you, Kurt, I read it and I love it. So,
well, I mean, somebody made my day today. I feel bad. I can't remember his name, but I've had a bad week for a bunch of reasons because the chipmunks are annoying me, so to speak. And he said, well, you don't have to worry because there's millions of people out there who want this, and they're the only ones that matter.
Yes, that's right. The ones that want this actually, if you do the analysis, have the most ability to project power at the end of the day.
So something to offend everyone, including naming the enemy and the enemies and explaining their strategy. And
yes,
I'm not gentle about it. It's a prosecution like you'd hear in court. It's not kind.
That's great, Kurt. And then in your notes, you also mentioned, I don't know if you want to talk about the primary audience for this. I know you mentioned the military is definitely going to be part of the audience for this.
The audience. Oh, I think I cut that out of this. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's completely fine. But it really touches on what we were just saying, that the people that matter are the audience for this.
The people who matter are the audience. Yeah, let's flip it around and say, I'm going to be my usual arrogant self that people appreciate so much. And that's that, guys, I work very hard. I know a lot of stuff. And honestly, if you disagree with something here, you need to ask me why, not just presume I'm wrong. There's very low chance I'm wrong.
Yes, and I would agree with that, is if you're reading something or hearing something and you don't quite understand it,
ask. I don't mind asking.
Just ask. Yeah, just ask.